They say the truth always comes to light, but sometimes it takes a single frame of security footage to illuminate years of darkness. My name is Willow Chen-Martinez, and 6 months ago, I was arrested on charges that could have destroyed everything I'd worked for. The person who filed those charges? My ex-fiancé's prosecutor sister, someone who wielded the law like a personal weapon. But technology has a way of revealing what people try to hide, and sometimes the very cameras meant to protect us become the instruments of our salvation. This is the story of how I lost everything, found my strength, and discovered that justice isn't always served in a courtroom. Sometimes it's captured in pixels and timestamps that can't lie. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months ago, my life looked nothing like it does today. I was 26 years old, living in a cozy 2-bedroom apartment in downtown Portland, Oregon, with my golden retriever, Scout, and what I thought was a promising future ahead of me. My days were structured around routine and ambition, two things that had always served me well. Every morning at 6:30 a.m., I'd lace up my running shoes and take Scout for our daily 3-mile loop through Laurelhurst Park. The neighborhood was one of those places where people knew each other's names, where Mr. and Mrs. Patterson from Unit 4B would wave from their balcony as I passed, and where the local coffee shop owner, Diana, knew my order before I reached the counter. "Medium oat milk latte, extra shot, no foam," she'd call out with a smile that made even Monday mornings bearable. I worked as a junior architect at Richardson and Associates, a mid-sized firm specializing in sustainable residential design. It wasn't glamorous work, mostly drafting revisions and running calculations for senior architects, but I was building something. Every blueprint I perfected, every client meeting I attended, every late night I spent learning new design software was an investment in the career I'd dreamed about since I was 12 years old, sketching floor plans on napkins at my grandmother's kitchen table. The firm's office occupied the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in the Pearl District, with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded our workstations with natural light. My desk sat in the corner, positioned so I could look out over the Willamette River while I worked. On clear days, I could see Mount Hood in the distance, its snow-capped peak a reminder that beauty existed beyond spreadsheets and structural calculations. My colleague and friend, Marcus Thompson, occupied the workstation next to mine. We'd started at the firm on the same day 8 months earlier, bonding over shared imposter syndrome and an obsession with Frank Lloyd Wright's philosophy of organic architecture. Marcus was one of those people who made work feel less like work, always ready with a terrible joke when deadlines loomed, or a thoughtful question when I was stuck on a design problem. "You know what your problem is, Willow?" he'd say, spinning in his chair to face me during our afternoon coffee breaks. "You think too much. Sometimes the best designs come from instinct, not calculation." I'd roll my eyes and throw a crumpled Post-it note at him, but he wasn't wrong. I had a tendency to overthink, to measure twice and cut once, then measure 3 more times just to be sure. It was a trait that served me well professionally, but sometimes held me back personally. My apartment reflected this careful, measured approach to life. Everything had its place. Books arranged by genre and author, spices alphabetized in the kitchen, Scout's toys organized in a wicker basket by the front door. The walls displayed a carefully curated collection of architectural photography, black and white images of brutalist buildings I'd captured during a college trip to Boston, color prints of mid-century modern homes from a weekend getaway to Palm Springs. The living room centered around a vintage Danish modern sofa I'd found at an estate sale and spent 3 weekends refinishing. Across from it sat my pride and joy, a drafting table my grandmother had given me when I graduated from architecture school. It was where I worked on personal projects, sketches for the house I hoped to design and build someday, concepts for community spaces that could bring people together, drawings that existed purely for the joy of creating. Evenings followed a predictable pattern. I'd arrive home around 6:30, take Scout for a shorter walk around the neighborhood, and then settle into my kitchen to cook dinner. I wasn't a sophisticated chef, but I'd developed a repertoire of healthy, simple meals that I could prepare while listening to podcasts about design, urban planning, or true crime, my guilty pleasure that Marcus constantly teased me about.
You realize you're going to give yourself nightmares, he'd say when I mentioned the latest murder mystery I'd binged. But there was something about the methodical way investigators pieced together evidence that appealed to my architect's brain. The attention to detail, the way small clues connected to reveal larger patterns. It wasn't so different from solving design problems. Weekends were mine. Saturday mornings meant farmers market runs with Scout, who had become something of a local celebrity among the vendors. Mrs. Rodriguez at the produce stand always saved him a carrot, and Tom from the bakery would slip me day-old pastries for the beautiful dog. Saturday afternoons were for personal projects or exploring Portland's neighborhoods, camera in hand, documenting interesting architectural details that might inspire future designs. Sunday was my day of rest, though rest usually meant reorganizing my bookshelves, meal prepping for the week, or video calling my family back in Sacramento. My parents, both high school teachers, would catch me up on the neighborhood gossip and my younger brother Jake's latest adventures in his first year of college. These calls were anchors in my week, reminders of where I came from and the people who believed in me unconditionally. The neighborhood I lived in felt like a small town within the city. Maple Heights was a collection of 1920s apartment buildings and small houses. Tree-lined streets where people walked their dogs and children rode bikes on sidewalks. The local grocery store, Henderson's Market, was the kind of place where the cashiers knew your name and would order special items if you asked nicely. My building, Riverside Apartments, was a 4-story brick structure with 12 units, built in 1925 and carefully maintained by our landlord, Robert Kim. He lived in the building with his wife and took pride in preserving its original character while updating the necessities. Our apartments had hardwood floors, high ceilings, and the kind of architectural details you don't find in modern construction. Crown molding, built-in bookcases, windows with divided panes that caught the light beautifully. I knew most of my neighbors, at least to nod and exchange pleasantries. There was Mrs. Sullivan in 2A, a retired librarian who always had fascinating book recommendations. The young couple in 3C, both nurses, who worked opposite shifts and passed each other like ships in the hallway. And Carlos in 4A, a chef who worked at one of Portland's trendy restaurants and sometimes shared leftovers with those of us lucky enough to be home when he returned from his shifts. The building had a small courtyard in the back where residents could grill or just sit and read. Scout loved this space, and it's where he'd made friends with Pixel, Mrs. Sullivan's elderly tabby cat, and Luna, a German Shepherd mix that belonged to the nurses in 3C. There was something comforting about this little community, this sense of belonging to something larger than just my individual life. My daily routine was interrupted only by work deadlines, the occasional evening out with colleagues, or weekend visits from my college friend Sarah, who lived in Seattle, and would drive down once a month for what we called our architecture adventures. Tours of interesting buildings, visits to new developments, or simply long walks through neighborhoods we'd never explored. This was my life. Predictable, purposeful, quietly satisfying. I had goals and plans, a 5-year roadmap that included earning my architectural license, saving for a down payment on a small house, and eventually starting my own sustainable design practice. I had routines that grounded me, relationships that nurtured me, and work that challenged me in all the right ways. I thought I understood how the world worked. I believed that hard work led to success, that honesty bred trust, that people were generally good and systems were generally fair. I thought the most dramatic thing that might happen to me would be a difficult client or a design that didn't win a competition. I had no idea that everything I'd built, everything I trusted, everything I believed about justice and truth and the basic fairness of life was about to be tested in ways I never could have imagined. But that morning, That last morning of my old life, I woke up at 6:25, 5 minutes before my alarm, the way I always did. Scout was already stretching at the foot of my bed, ready for our run. The coffee maker I'd programmed the night before was filling the apartment with the rich aroma of freshly brewed beans. Everything was exactly as it should be. I had no way of knowing that by evening, everything would change forever.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The call came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday while I was hunched over my drafting table reviewing structural calculations for the Henderson family's passive solar home. Marcus had just returned from lunch with a bag of Thai food that filled our corner of the office with the scent of basil and chili oil. Willow Chen-Martinez? The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, with an authority that made my stomach clench before I even understood why. Yes, this is Willow. This is Detective Angela Morrison with the Portland Police Bureau. I need you to come down to the precinct for questioning regarding an incident that occurred last night at 847 Pine Street. The address hit me like cold water. That was Trevor's apartment. Trevor Hendricks, my ex-fiancé of 3 months, the man I'd spent 2 years of my life with before discovering that his idea of partnership meant controlling every aspect of my existence. The breakup had been messy, painful, but final. Or so I thought. I'm sorry, what kind of incident? My voice sounded strange to my own ears, higher pitched than normal. There's been some kind of mistake. I wasn't anywhere near Pine Street last night. I was at home all evening. Ma'am, I understand this is concerning, but I really need you to come in so we can sort this out. Can you be here within the hour? After I hung up, Marcus abandoned his lunch entirely. What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost. I explained the call in halting sentences, my mind racing to make sense of what felt like a surreal mistake. Trevor and I had dated for 2 years before I finally found the courage to end our engagement. He was charming, successful, and had a way of making me feel special until gradually, almost imperceptibly, that specialness became a cage. It started small, suggestions about my clothes that became stronger opinions, questions about where I'd been that became interrogations about who I'd talked to. His hands on my shoulders during conversations, thumbs pressing just hard enough to remind me of his presence. The way he'd go silent when I mentioned Marcus or other male colleagues, then later make cutting comments about my inappropriate workplace friendships. The final straw came during a dinner party at his sister's house. I'd been discussing sustainable architecture with one of the other guests, animated and engaged in a way that felt natural and joyful. When we got home, Trevor exploded. He accused me of flirting, of making him look foolish, of caring more about impressing strangers than supporting her fiancé. His voice never rose above a conversational level. He was too controlled for that, but his words cut deep, designed to make me question my own perceptions and motivations. That night, lying awake beside him, I realized I'd become someone I didn't recognize. The confident woman who'd graduated summa cum laude from architecture school had been replaced by someone who second-guessed every conversation, every outfit, every decision. I was walking on eggshells in my own life. Breaking up with Trevor required 3 attempts. The first time, he convinced me I was overreacting, that all couples went through rough patches, that his concern for me was being misinterpreted as control. The second time, he promised to change, even suggested couples therapy, which lasted exactly 2 sessions before he declared the therapist biased against men. The third time, I didn't give him a chance to argue. I waited until he was at work, packed my belongings, left my engagement ring on his kitchen counter with a letter explaining my decision, and blocked his number. I stayed with Sarah in Seattle for a week, afraid he might show up at my apartment, but he never did. After a month of silence, I began to believe I was free. There had been a few uncomfortable encounters since then. Portland's a small city, especially in certain circles, and we'd run into each other twice at coffee shops and once at a gallery opening. Each time, Trevor was polite but cold, treating me like a stranger who'd once inconvenienced him. The last time I saw him was at Henderson's Market 3 weeks ago. He was in the produce section with a blonde woman I didn't recognize, his hand possessively placed on his lower back in that familiar way that made my skin crawl with memory. We'd made eye contact across the store. He'd nodded curtly and turned away. I grabbed my groceries and left, heart pounding with a mixture of relief and residual fear that surprised me with its intensity. I thought that was the end of it. Now, sitting in Marcus's ancient Honda Civic as he drove me to the police station, I tried to piece together what could have happened. Had someone who looked like me been at Trevor's apartment? Was this some kind of mistaken identity? Or was Trevor lying? But why would he lie about something so serious, so easily disproven? Maybe there's security footage, Marcus suggested as we pulled into the parking lot of the central precinct. Your building has cameras, right? That should clear everything up quickly. The police station was nothing like the sleek, dramatic buildings you see on TV. It was a utilitarian, concrete structure from the 1970s, all harsh angles and small windows. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. The air smelled like industrial disinfectant and old coffee.
Detective Morrison turned out to be a woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of steady, assessing gaze that made me feel both protected and scrutinized. She led me to a small interview room with beige walls, a metal table, and 3 uncomfortable chairs. Before we begin, she said, settling across from me with a thick folder, I want to remind you that you have the right to have an attorney present during this questioning. Do I need one? The question came out smaller than I intended. That's entirely up to you. You're not under arrest, but you are being questioned in connection with a serious allegation. I decided to proceed without a lawyer, confident that the truth would be obvious once I explained where I'd actually been. Detective Morrison opened her folder and began reading from what appeared to be an official report. According to Trevor's statement, I had appeared at his apartment at approximately 9:30 p.m. the previous evening, agitated and irrational. He claimed I'd been drinking, a detail that particularly stung since I rarely drank more than a glass of wine with dinner, and never when I was upset. He alleged that when he tried to close the door, I forced my way inside and became physically aggressive, throwing objects and ultimately striking him in the face with what he described as a ceramic picture frame. The details were specific enough to be believable and wrong enough to be maddening. Trevor knew my habits, my mannerisms, my vulnerabilities. If someone wanted to fabricate a believable story about me losing control, he'd be the person best equipped to do it. Mr. Hendricks has photographs of facial injuries consistent with being struck, Detective Morrison continued. He also provided this. She slid a clear plastic evidence bag across the table. Inside was a silver bracelet I recognized immediately, not because it was mine, but because it wasn't. The bracelet was similar to one I owned, a simple chain with small geometric charms, but this one had details that were wrong. The clasp was different, and there was a small heart charm that I would never have chosen. He says you left this behind when you fled the scene. I stared at the bracelet, my mind reeling. Someone had gone to significant trouble to create physical evidence. This wasn't a simple lie or a case of mistaken identity. This was deliberate, calculated, designed to frame me. Detective Morrison, I need you to understand something. I was not at Trevor Hendricks' apartment last night. I was at home all evening, from about 6 p.m. until I went to bed around 11. I can prove it. I explained about the Netflix documentary, about Scout needing his evening medications at specific times, about the neighbor, Mrs. Sullivan, who'd knocked on my door around 10 p.m. to borrow sugar for a late-night baking project. I offered my phone records, my streaming history, anything that might demonstrate my whereabouts. Detective Morrison took notes, but didn't seem particularly impressed by my alibi. These are all things that could be fabricated or manipulated, she pointed out. Do you have anyone who can verify your presence at home? Someone who saw you? That's when the first cold finger of real fear touched my spine. I lived alone except for Scout. My apartment building's hallways were empty most evenings.
Mrs. Sullivan's sugar request had lasted maybe 2 minutes, and I realized with growing horror that even that brief interaction wouldn't necessarily prove I'd been home all evening. "There might be security footage," I said, grasping for the lifeline Marcus had suggested earlier. "My building has cameras in the lobby and the parking garage, and Trevor's building must have security cameras too, right? If I was never there, the footage would show that." Detective Morrison made another note. "We'll certainly look into that. In the meantime, I need to inform you that Mr. Hendricks has decided to press charges. You're not being arrested today, but a warrant will likely be issued within 24 hours. The room felt like it was shrinking around me. A warrant. Charges. This wasn't just a misunderstanding that would be cleared up with a few phone calls. This was real, and it was happening to me. "Detective," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "why would Trevor do this? We broke up months ago. It was difficult, but it was over. I haven't contacted him, haven't bothered him, haven't even driven down his street. Why would he lie about something like this?" Detective Morrison studied my face for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was kinder than it had been. "Ms. Chen-Martinez, in my experience, domestic violence cases are rarely straightforward. There are often complex dynamics involved, histories that aren't immediately apparent. Sometimes people file false reports for attention or revenge. Sometimes they file truthful reports that sound unbelievable. My job is to investigate the facts, not to make assumptions about anyone's motives." She stood up, signaling that our interview was over. "I strongly recommend you contact an attorney. If charges are filed, you'll need representation. And please don't leave the Portland area without notifying us." Walking out of that police station, I felt like I was entering a different world than the one I'd inhabited that morning. The same sun was shining, the same cars were driving down the same streets, but everything looked slightly unreal, as if I was seeing it all through a pane of distorted glass. Marcus was waiting in his car, engine running. "How did it go?" "Not good," I said, buckling my seatbelt with hands that trembled slightly. "He's pressing charges. There's going to be a warrant." As we drove back to the office, I stared out the window at the city I'd called home for 4 years, wondering if I was about to lose everything I'd built here: my job, my apartment, my reputation, my future. All of it suddenly felt fragile, contingent on proving something that should have been impossible to doubt. I was innocent, but innocence, I was beginning to learn, might not be enough.
The arrest warrant came through at 6:23 a.m. on Thursday morning. I know the exact time because I was staring at my phone when Detective Morrison called, having barely slept for 2 nights straight. Scout was pressed against my legs on the couch where I'd been sitting since 4 a.m., scrolling through legal advice websites and trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. "Mrs. Chen-Martinez, I wanted to give you a heads up before we send officers to your location. The warrant has been issued for assault in the 4th degree. You can either turn yourself in or we'll come to you." Turn myself in. The words felt surreal, like dialogue from someone else's life. I was Willow Chen-Martinez. I recycled religiously, helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, and had never even gotten a speeding ticket. Yet here I was, about to become a criminal defendant. "I'll come in," I heard myself say. "Give me an hour to arrange care for my dog." After hanging up, I sat in the growing dawn light filtering through my living room windows, looking at the life I'd built around me. My grandmother's drafting table with its neat stack of current projects, the bookshelves filled with architectural theory and design inspiration, Scout's favorite rope toy abandoned on the hardwood floor after last night's abbreviated play session. Everything looked the same, but I felt like I was seeing it through a lens that had shifted focus, making familiar objects appear foreign and temporary. This apartment, this life, these routines, none of it was as solid as I'd believed. It could all be taken away based on someone else's lies. The first call I made was to my parents in Sacramento. Dad answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Willow? Honey, it's barely 6:30. Is everything okay?"
How do you tell your parents, two people who'd worked their entire lives as high school teachers, who'd raised you to believe in fairness and truth and the basic decency of institutions, that you're about to be arrested for something you didn't do? Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not panic. I heard him shifting, probably sitting up in bed, alerting Mom with his sudden tension. Someone has filed false charges against me, domestic violence charges. I'm going to be arrested this morning. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Dad's voice, carefully controlled. What kind of charges, and what do you mean by false? I explained everything. Trevor, the allegations, the planted evidence, the security cameras that I prayed would vindicate me. Mom had taken the phone by the time I finished, her voice tight with protective fury. We're driving up. You don't dare face this alone. Mom, you can't. You both have classes and Willow Chen-Martinez. She interrupted, using my full name the way she had when I was 7 years old and had tried to hide a broken vase. Our daughter is being falsely accused of a crime. Do you really think we care about anything else right now? The second call was to Marcus, who arrived at my apartment 40 minutes later with coffee and bagels and the name of a criminal defense attorney his cousin had used during a DUI case 2 years earlier. Jennifer Walsh, he said, handing me a business card. Apparently, she's tough as nails and doesn't back down from prosecutors. My cousin said she'd walk through fire for her clients. Jennifer Walsh's office was in a converted Victorian house in the Hawthorne district, painted deep blue with white trim and surrounded by a garden that managed to look both professional and welcoming. I'd called her from the car and she'd agreed to meet us before I turned myself in. She was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s, with silver-streaked auburn hair and the kind of intense focus that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. Her office was lined with law books and featured a large window overlooking Mount Tabor. Tell me everything, she said, settling behind her desk with a legal pad. Start from the beginning of your relationship with Trevor Hendricks, and don't leave out anything, even if it seems insignificant. For the next hour, I dissected 2 years of my life with surgical precision, the gradual erosion of my independence, Trevor's need to control my schedule, my friendships, my appearance, the way he'd isolate me from colleagues and friends, always with reasonable-sounding explanations that left me feeling guilty for questioning his motives. He never hit me, not even came close, but there were moments when I felt threatened. Not physically exactly, but like he was always reminding me that he could take away my sense of safety if he wanted to. Jennifer made notes throughout my story, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with those sharp eyes. Here's what I think is happening. This isn't just about revenge, though that's certainly part of it. Your ex-fiancé strikes me as someone who views relationships as ownership. When you left him, you didn't just break up with him, you reclaimed something he considered his property. That's a narcissistic injury that some people can't tolerate. She pulled out another file and flipped through several pages. I did some research on Trevor Hendricks after your call this morning. He's a successful financial advisor, clean record, well-connected in the community. But more importantly, his sister is Amanda Hendricks, a prosecutor with the district attorney's office.
The words hit me like a physical blow. His sister is a prosecutor? Senior prosecutor, actually. She's handled dozens of domestic violence cases and has a reputation for being particularly aggressive in pursuing convictions. She wouldn't be able to prosecute your case directly due to the conflict of interest, but she'd know exactly how to advise her brother on building the strongest possible case against you. I felt like I was falling through space, grasping for something solid to hold on to. This wasn't just Trevor's revenge. It was a coordinated attack by someone who understood the legal system intimately, someone who knew exactly which details would be most damaging, which evidence would be most convincing. So what do we do? Marcus asked. He'd been silent throughout my story, but I could see the anger building in his posture, the way his hands clenched and unclenched on his knees. Jennifer leaned forward, her expression serious but not without hope. "We fight, but I need you to understand what you're up against, Willow. This isn't going to be a quick resolution. The evidence against you is circumstantial, but it's been carefully constructed. The bracelet, the photos of Trevor's injuries, his detailed statement, it all creates a coherent narrative that a jury might find believable." She outlined the potential consequences. If convicted, I could face up to a year in jail, substantial fines, and a permanent criminal record that would effectively end my career in architecture. Most licensing boards wouldn't approve someone with a domestic violence conviction. My reputation would be destroyed, my future derailed. However, she continued, there are several things working in our favor. The timing of these charges, coming months after your breakup, is suspicious. The fact that you have no history of violence, no previous complaints, no pattern of behavior consistent with their allegations, all of that helps us. And if we can get security camera footage that contradicts their timeline, we might be able to prove this is fabricated. The decision I faced wasn't really about whether to fight the charges. Innocence demanded that I fight. The real decision was about how much of my life I was willing to sacrifice to prove that innocence, and whether I had the strength to endure what was coming. Jennifer explained the process. I'd be arrested, booked, and released on my own recognizance, given that I had no criminal history and strong community ties. There would be a restraining order preventing any contact with Trevor. The preliminary hearing would be scheduled within a few weeks, followed by months of discovery, investigation, and preparation before a potential trial. During this entire process, she warned, your life will be under a microscope. The prosecution will investigate every aspect of your past, looking for anything they can use to support their narrative. Your friends, your colleagues, your family, they'll all be drawn into this. Your employer will likely learn about the charges. It's going to be expensive, exhausting, and emotionally devastating. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. I've seen innocent people accept plea bargains just to make the ordeal stop. I've seen careers destroyed and families torn apart by false accusations. But I've also seen the truth emerge, sometimes in unexpected ways. The question is, are you prepared for the fight of your life? I looked out her window at Mount Tabor, its slopes covered in trees that had weathered countless storms. Some of those trees bore scars from lightning strikes, disease, human interference, but they were still standing, still reaching toward the light. Jennifer, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. 6 months ago, I thought the biggest challenge in my life would be passing my architectural licensing exam. I thought justice was something that happened automatically when you told the truth. I thought the system was designed to protect innocent people. I turned back to face her, feeling something crystallize inside me. Not confidence exactly, but determination. I was naive, but I wasn't wrong about who I am. I didn't assault Trevor Hendricks. I won't let him and his prosecutor sister destroy my life with lies. So yes, I'm prepared to fight. Marcus reached over and squeezed my hand. You're not fighting alone. Jennifer smiled for the first time since I'd entered her office. Good, because we're going to need to be smart, thorough, and relentless. The truth is on our side, but that's not enough. We're going to have to prove it, piece by piece, until even the most skeptical jury can't ignore it. She stood up and gathered her papers. Ready to go turn yourself in? The drive to the police station felt different this time. 2 days ago, I'd gone there as a confused witness, trying to clear up a misunderstanding. Now I was driving there as a defendant, someone who would soon have a booking photo and fingerprints on file, someone who would have to check a box marked, "Have you ever been arrested?" for the rest of my life. But I was also driving there as someone who had chosen to fight
rather than submit. Someone who had decided that the truth was worth defending, regardless of the cost. The scared, compliant woman who had let Trevor gradually erode her confidence over 2 years was gone. In her place was someone I was only beginning to know, someone harder, more determined, and absolutely unwilling to be anyone's victim ever again. As we pulled into the parking lot, I thought about the security cameras that might hold the key to my freedom. Somewhere in Portland, there are hard drives and servers containing digital proof of my innocence. The challenge would be finding them, accessing them, and making sure they hadn't been mysteriously corrupted or deleted. The fight for my life was about to begin, and I intended to win it.
The booking process stripped away more than just my personal belongings. It dismantled every assumption I'd held about dignity and presumed innocence. Fingerprints, mugshots, the humiliating surrender of shoelaces and jewelry. By the time I walked out of the Multnomah County Justice Center 3 hours later, released on my own recognizance, I felt like I'd been hollowed out and reassembled incorrectly. Jennifer was waiting in the lobby with a manila folder thick with documents and a grim expression that told me the real work was just beginning. My parents had driven up from Sacramento and were standing beside her. My mother's eyes red-rimmed but determined, my father's jaw set in that way that meant he was barely containing his rage. "How are you holding up?" Mom asked, pulling me into a fierce hug that smelled like her familiar lavender perfume and the coffee she'd undoubtedly consumed during the 4-hour drive. "I'm okay," I lied, because what else could I say? That I felt like a stranger in my own body? That the fluorescent lights and echoing corridors of the Justice Center had made me feel like I was disappearing? Jennifer guided us to a quiet corner of the lobby where she spread out paperwork on a small table. "We need to move quickly on several fronts," she said, her voice businesslike but not unkind. "First, the restraining order is now in effect. You cannot contact Trevor Hendricks in any way. Cannot go within 500 feet of his residence or workplace. Violation of that order would result in immediate arrest and would severely damage our case." She handed me a copy of the order, the legal language making our situation feel even more surreal. 2 years ago, this man had proposed to me in Pioneer Courthouse Square, getting down on one knee while tourists took pictures and a street musician played violin. Now, a court document prohibited me from being in the same neighborhood. "Second," Jennifer continued, "we need to start building our defense immediately. That means documenting everything about your whereabouts on Tuesday night, gathering character witnesses, and, most importantly, tracking down security camera footage before it gets routinely deleted." The next morning, I found myself standing outside the management office of Riverside Apartments at 8 a.m. sharp, waiting for our landlord Robert Kim to arrive. I'd barely slept, my mind racing through everything Jennifer had explained about evidence preservation and the narrow windows we had to work within. Mr. Kim was a methodical man in his 60s who took pride in maintaining both the building and detailed records. When I explained what I needed, his usual calm demeanor shifted to concern and then to protective determination. "Of course, Willow," he said, unlocking the office door. "This is completely ridiculous. I've known you for 2 years. You couldn't hurt a fly." He paused, studying my face. "Are you okay? You look like you haven't slept." The security system at Riverside Apartments was more comprehensive than I realized. Cameras covered the main entrance, the parking garage, the mailbox area, and the rear courtyard. Mr. Kim pulled up the footage from Tuesday evening on his computer, and we watched together as the digital timestamp marked the hours of my alleged crime. There I was at 6:47 p.m., entering the building with Scout after our evening walk. The camera clearly showed my face, my clothes, jeans, and a green sweater I'd worn to work that day. At 7:23 p.m., another camera caught me in the mailbox area checking the day's delivery. At 9:52 p.m., the hallway camera recorded Mrs. Sullivan knocking on my door, our brief sugar borrowing exchange, and her return to her apartment. Most importantly, there was no footage of me leaving the building between 6:47 p.m. and the next morning. If I had driven to Trevor's apartment to assault him at 9:30 p.m., I would have to have left Riverside Apartments. The cameras proved I never did. "This is it," I said, feeling the first spark of genuine hope since Detective Morrison's phone call. I was here all night. Mr. Kim was already burning the footage to a disk. He said, "I'll make several copies, and I'm going to back up everything to a secure server off-site. If someone tries to make this evidence disappear, they'll have to get through me first." But our relief was short-lived. When Jennifer presented the security footage to the prosecution's office, the response was swift and deflating. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Voss, a colleague of Amanda Hendricks who had been assigned to handle my case, dismissed the evidence with bureaucratic efficiency. Security camera timestamps can be manipulated, she argued during a pretrial conference I wasn't allowed to attend. Ms. Chen-Martinez could have left through a rear exit not covered by cameras, or the footage could have been altered after the fact. Without corroborating witnesses who actually saw her in her apartment during the critical time frame, this evidence is inconclusive. Jennifer called me with the news while I was sitting in my car outside Henderson Market, having just completed the surreal experience of grocery shopping while under criminal charges. Regular life continued. I still needed food, Scout still needed his medication, bills still needed to be paid, but everything felt performative, like I was acting out the role of a normal person while my real life hung in legal limbo. "Aren't they accepting the apartment footage?" I asked, watching other customers walk in and out of the store with their everyday problems and everyday concerns. "Not as definitive proof," Jennifer said. "We need more. I've filed subpoenas for security camera footage from every business and building within a 5-block radius of Trevor's apartment. If you were never there, then hopefully we can create a timeline that makes their story impossible." The subpoena process revealed the first major obstacle. Digital evidence has a shelf life. Most businesses kept security footage for 30 to 45 days before automatically deleting it to save storage space. Trevor had waited over 2 weeks after the alleged incident to file charges, and it had been another week since then. We were racing against automatic deletion schedules, and some of the evidence we needed might already be gone.
Marcus took vacation days to help me canvass the neighborhood around Pine Street, identifying every potential camera that might have captured footage of me not being there on Tuesday night. We created a map marking restaurants, shops, apartment buildings, traffic cameras, and ATMs, anywhere that might have recorded relevant footage. The process was exhausting and often humiliating. At each location, I had to explain why I needed their security footage, which meant revealing that I was under criminal investigation. Some business owners were sympathetic and helpful. Others looked at me with suspicion, as if criminal charges were contagious. At Powell's Books on Burnside, the manager listened to my request with growing concern. "I'm sorry," she said finally, "but we had a server crash last week. We lost about 10 days of security footage, including Tuesday night." At Cafe Luna, 3 blocks from Trevor's apartment, the owner shook his head apologetically. "We only keep footage for 2 weeks. It got overwritten yesterday." Each dead end felt like another door closing, another piece of potential evidence disappearing into digital oblivion. I began to understand how people could be convicted of crimes they didn't commit, not because the system was deliberately malicious, but because truth was fragile and evidence was ephemeral. The investigation also revealed unsettling details about Trevor's preparation. When Jennifer's private investigator looked into the timeline more carefully, we discovered that Trevor had visited an urgent care clinic the morning after the alleged assault, seeking treatment for facial injuries that he claimed I had inflicted. The medical records showed bruising and a small cut consistent with being struck by a blunt object. "He actually injured himself," I said, staring at the medical report in Jennifer's office. "He hit himself in the face hard enough to need medical attention. Just to frame me?" "It appears that way," Jennifer agreed, "but proving it is another matter. The injuries are real, documented by medical professionals. The question is whether we can demonstrate that you couldn't have caused them." Meanwhile, the charges were affecting every aspect of my life. Word had spread through the architecture firm, not maliciously, but inevitably. My supervisor, Patricia Richardson, called me into her office for what she termed a difficult conversation. "Willow, I want you to know that I don't believe these charges for a second, but I could hear the however coming. However, we have several projects involving city contracts, and the morality clauses in those agreements could be problematic if this case goes to trial. I'm not saying we're letting you go, but you may need to take a leave of absence if this drags on."
The financial implications were staggering. Criminal defense wasn't cheap, and reduced income would make it even harder to pay Jennifer's fees. My parents offered to help, but they were teachers, comfortable but not wealthy. I found myself calculating how long I could afford to fight for my innocence before financial reality forced me to consider a plea bargain. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Jennifer explained that this was our first formal opportunity to challenge the prosecution's case, to cross-examine Trevor, and to present our evidence to a judge. If we could get the charges dismissed at this early stage, I could begin rebuilding my life immediately. But as the hearing approached, new obstacles emerged. Trevor's sister, Amanda, despite the conflict of interest, seemed to be advising the prosecution behind the scenes. Rachel Voss filed motions challenging every piece of exculpatory evidence we'd gathered, from the security footage to character witness statements from my colleagues. Most troubling was a motion claiming that I had a history of erratic behavior during my relationship with Trevor. They'd interviewed mutual acquaintances who confirmed that I'd become increasingly withdrawn and paranoid during our final months together, behavior they now characterized as evidence of my potential for violence. The irony was bitter. The isolation and hypervigilance I developed as responses to Trevor's controlling behavior were being used as evidence that I was unstable enough to assault him. My symptoms of psychological abuse were being reframed as proof of my guilt. On Sunday night before the hearing, I sat at my grandmother's drafting table trying to work on a personal project to calm my nerves. Scout was curled at my feet, occasionally lifting his head when he sensed my anxiety spike. The house was quiet except for the sound of rain against the windows and the distant hum of traffic on Division Street. I thought about the woman I'd been just 2 weeks ago. Confident, purposeful, building toward a future that seemed solid and achievable. That woman felt like a stranger now. Someone naive and unprepared for the complexities of a world where truth didn't automatically triumph over lies. But I also thought about what Jennifer had said about fighting for my life and what that really meant. It wasn't just about proving my innocence in court. It was about refusing to let someone else's malice define my story. It was about becoming strong enough to withstand whatever came next. Tomorrow, I would sit in a courtroom while Trevor Hendricks told lies about me under oath. I would watch him perform the role of victim while I was cast as the villain. But I would also get my first chance to fight back, to present the truth, and to trust that justice, however slowly and imperfectly, might eventually prevail. The preliminary hearing would show us just how steep this mountain really was. But I was ready to start climbing.
The preliminary hearing began at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I sat beside Jennifer at the defendant's table, wearing a navy blue suit I'd bought specifically for court appearances, clothes that were supposed to project innocence and respectability, but felt like a costume for a role I never auditioned for. Judge Margaret Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, presided over courtroom 4B, a wood-paneled space that managed to feel both imposing and cramped. She was a woman in her late 50s with silver hair and the kind of piercing gaze that suggested she'd heard every lie ever told and retained a healthy skepticism about human nature. Trevor sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, flanked by a woman I recognized from photos as his sister Amanda. She wasn't officially part of the prosecution team, but her presence felt like a statement, a reminder that this case had influential backing. Trevor looked smaller than I remembered, but that might have been the context. In this formal setting, wearing a dark suit and displaying faded yellow bruises around his left eye, he looked like what he was supposed to be, a victim. When he took the witness stand, I felt my stomach clench with a mixture of fury and disbelief. This was the same man who had systematically undermined my confidence for 2 years, who had made me question my own perceptions and judgment. Now he was about to weaponize the legal system against me with the same calculated precision he'd once used to control my daily life. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Voss led Trevor through his testimony with practiced efficiency. Yes, he had been engaged to the defendant. Yes, the relationship had ended several months ago. Yes, he had been surprised and frightened when I appeared at his apartment that Tuesday evening. Mr. Hendricks,
Can you describe the defendant's demeanor when she arrived at your residence? Trevor's voice was steady, tinged with what sounded like genuine trauma. She seemed agitated, upset about something. I could smell alcohol on her breath. When I tried to talk to her calmly, she became increasingly angry. Listening to him lie under oath was like watching a master craftsman at work. Every detail was plausible, every emotion seemed authentic. He described me forcing my way into his apartment, throwing his belongings, screaming accusations about him ruining my life. The crescendo came when he claimed I grabbed a ceramic picture frame from his coffee table and struck him in the face. I was shocked, he said, touching the faded bruise gingerly. Willow had never been physically violent before, but she'd been acting increasingly erratic in the months before our breakup. I was honestly afraid of what she might do next. The medical evidence was devastating. Dr. Sarah Kim from the urgent care clinic testified about Trevor's injuries. Bruising, a small laceration, trauma consistent with being struck by a blunt object. The photographs were graphic and compelling. Trevor's face swollen and discolored, looking exactly like someone who'd been assaulted. When Jennifer's turn came for cross-examination, I watched her transform from the supportive attorney I'd come to know into something sharper and more dangerous. She approached Trevor with the kind of quiet intensity that filled the courtroom with tension. Mr. Hendricks, you stated that my client appeared at your apartment at approximately 9:30 p.m. on Tuesday evening. Is that correct? Yes. And this was the first time you'd seen her since your breakup several months ago? Trevor hesitated for just a moment. We'd run into each other a few times around the city, but yes, this was the first time she'd come to my apartment. When you ran into each other previously, how would you describe those encounters? Brief, polite. She seemed distant. Jennifer pulled out a photograph and handed it to Trevor. Do you recognize this bracelet? It was the evidence bag containing the silver bracelet the prosecution claimed I'd left behind. Trevor nodded. Yes, Willow was wearing it when she attacked me. It must have come off during the struggle. Mr. Hendricks, are you certain this bracelet belongs to my client? Absolutely. I remember it clearly. Jennifer walked back to our table and retrieved another evidence bag, this one containing my actual bracelet, the one I'd been wearing to work every day for the past month. She placed both bags side by side in front of Trevor. Mr. Hendricks, can you point to which bracelet actually belongs to my client? The color drained from Trevor's face as he stared at the two bracelets. They were similar, but clearly different. Different clasps, different charms, different levels of wear. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before he finally admitted he couldn't be certain which was which. Mr. Hendricks, Jennifer continued, when did you first notice the injuries to your face? Immediately after I was struck. But you didn't seek medical attention until the following morning. Can you explain why someone who was concerned enough about an assault to later file criminal charges waited 12 hours to see a doctor? Trevor's composure began to crack. I was in shock. I wasn't thinking clearly. Or, perhaps, Jennifer suggested, you needed time to ensure the injuries looked convincing enough to photograph. Rachel Voss objected, and Judge Chen sustained it, but the question had served its purpose. Seeds of doubt were being planted. The prosecution's case continued with character witnesses who painted me as increasingly unstable during my relationship with Trevor. Sarah Martinez, a former mutual friend, testified that I had become paranoid and withdrawn in the months before our breakup. Willow started accusing Trevor of trying to control her. She would make these elaborate claims about him monitoring her phone or trying to isolate her from friends. It seemed like she was looking for reasons to be upset with him. What Sarah didn't understand, what no one understood who hadn't lived it, was that those elaborate claims were accurate descriptions of Trevor's behavior. But presented to the court without context, my responses to psychological abuse looked like symptoms of mental instability. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a psychologist who had never met me but had reviewed the case materials, testified about patterns of behavior consistent with certain personality disorders that could manifest in violence. She spoke about narcissistic rage, borderline instability, the way some people could maintain a facade of normalcy while harboring deep-seated anger. Each expert witness felt like another nail in the coffin of my reputation. They weren't describing me, they were describing a fictional character, constructed from fragments of truth twisted into a narrative of guilt. But Jennifer had prepared her own witnesses. Marcus testified about my character, about the work we had done together, about my reputation for patience and professionalism. Mrs. Sullivan from my apartment building described our brief interaction on Tuesday night, confirming that I'd seemed calm and normal when she had borrowed sugar.
Mr. Kim presented the security footage from Riverside Apartments, walking the court through each timestamp that showed me at home during the alleged assault. But Rachel Voss had prepared for this, producing an expert witness who testified about the ease of manipulating digital timestamps and the existence of building exits not covered by security cameras. Even if we accept this footage as authentic, she argued, it doesn't preclude the possibility that Miss Chen-Martinez left the building through an unsurveilled exit, committed the assault, and returned the same way. The most devastating moment came when the prosecution played a voicemail I'd left on Trevor's phone 3 weeks after our breakup. In it, I sounded frustrated and angry, demanding that he return some books I'd left at his apartment. "Trevor, this is ridiculous," my recorded voice said. "I just want my things back. You can't keep ignoring me forever. This isn't over." Hearing my own words played in court, stripped of their context and imbued with sinister implications, was like watching my past self be transformed into a stalker. The books had been architectural texts I needed for work. The frustration in my voice came from Trevor's refusal to respond to any communication about returning my belongings. But presented to the court, it sounded like harassment, like evidence of an obsession that could escalate to violence. By the lunch recess, I felt like I was drowning. Every piece of evidence, every witness, every legal argument seemed to reinforce a version of reality where I was guilty. I sat in a small conference room with Jennifer, picking at a sandwich I couldn't taste, watching my future dissolve in real time. "They're winning," I said quietly. Jennifer looked up from her legal notes, her expression grim but not defeated. "It's not over yet. This afternoon we present our case, and I have a feeling the prosecution might have gotten overconfident." "What do you mean?" Trevor's testimony was too polished, too perfect. Real trauma victims usually have inconsistencies in their stories, memory gaps, emotional reactions that don't follow neat timelines. His account was like a script he'd rehearsed, and that bracelet moment, that was him realizing he'd made a mistake he couldn't fix. She gathered her papers and stood up. "Plus, I have one more card to play this afternoon, something the prosecution doesn't know about yet." When court resumed, Jennifer called her final witness, Detective Angela Morrison. I was surprised to see the detective who had first interviewed me taking the stand for the defense rather than the prosecution. Under Jennifer's questioning, Detective Morrison revealed details about the investigation that hadn't been presented earlier. She confirmed that she had found several aspects of Trevor's case unusual: the delay in reporting, the precision of his account, the convenient discovery of planted evidence. "In my 15 years investigating domestic violence cases," Detective Morrison testified, "I've learned to recognize certain patterns. Genuine victims often have fragmented memories, emotional reactions that interfere with clear recollection. Mr. Hendricks' account was unusually detailed and consistent, even about traumatic moments that typically cause memory disruption." But more importantly, Detective Morrison revealed that she had conducted her own investigation into the security cameras near Trevor's apartment building. While most businesses had indeed deleted their footage, one location had been overlooked: the parking garage of the office building directly across from Trevor's residence. The cameras operate on a longer retention schedule because they're part of a security system that covers multiple buildings, she explained. I was able to obtain footage from Tuesday evening showing the street entrance to Mr. Hendricks' building.
The footage was grainy and distant, but it clearly showed every person who entered Trevor's building between 9 p.m. and 10 p.m. on the night in question. There were only 3 people: an elderly woman with a walker, a delivery driver, and a blonde woman who was definitely not me. Rachel Voss objected strenuously, claiming the footage was too unclear to be definitive, but the damage was done. Combined with the apartment building footage showing I never left Riverside Apartments, we now had evidence from 2 independent sources that made the prosecution's timeline impossible. But the most devastating moment came when the prosecution played her final card. She presented phone records showing that Trevor had called his sister, Amanda, twice on the night of the alleged assault, once at 8:47 p.m., before I supposedly arrived, and again at 10:23 p.m. after I'd supposedly left. The calls lasted 14 and 26 minutes, respectively. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jennifer addressed the court, "these phone records raise a critical question. Why was Mr. Hendricks having lengthy conversations with a prosecutor in the district attorney's office both before and after an alleged assault, but didn't call 911 until the following morning?" The implication was clear. Trevor had been consulting with his prosecutor sister about how to construct and present his false allegations. The timing of the calls suggested premeditation rather than spontaneous reporting of a crime. As closing arguments began, I realized we had fought the prosecution to a standstill. They had a compelling narrative supported by medical evidence and character witnesses. We had security footage and expert testimony that challenged their timeline. The question was whether reasonable doubt had been established. Judge Chen took 20 minutes to deliberate, an eternity in preliminary hearing terms. When she returned, her expression was unreadable. "This case presents significant evidentiary conflicts that cannot be resolved at the preliminary hearing level," she began. "However, the prosecution has presented sufficient evidence to establish probable cause that a crime was committed and that the defendant may have committed it." My heart sank as she continued. "The case will proceed to trial. However, I'm modifying the conditions of release. Given the questions raised about the timeline and the lack of any prior history of violence, I'm reducing the restraining order to 200 feet and allowing Ms. Chen-Martinez to return to work without restrictions." It wasn't the victory we had hoped for, but it wasn't complete defeat either. As we gathered our papers and prepared to leave, Jennifer squeezed my shoulder. "We bloodied them," she said quietly. "They expected an easy preliminary hearing, and we made them work for every inch. More importantly, we've identified the weaknesses in their case. By the time we get to trial, we'll be ready." Walking out of the courthouse, I felt hollowed out, but not broken. The system hadn't vindicated me, but it hadn't crushed me either. The fight would continue, but now I understood the battlefield. Now I knew that sometimes justice wasn't about truth triumphing automatically. It was about being strong enough to keep fighting until the truth had no choice but to emerge.
3 weeks after the preliminary hearing, I was sitting in my apartment at 11:30 p.m., surrounded by case files and legal documents, when the breakthrough came from the most unexpected source: a 19-year-old college student named Emma Rodriguez who worked nights at a 24-hour laundromat 6 blocks from Trevor's apartment. The call came through Jennifer's emergency line. Emma had seen a news article about my case in the Portland State University newspaper, a small piece about local domestic violence prosecutions that had mentioned my name and the charges. Something about the details had bothered her enough to lose sleep for 3 nights before finally deciding to call. "I think I saw something that night," Emma told Jennifer over the phone while I listened on speaker. "The night that lady supposedly attacked her ex-boyfriend. I was working late at Spin Cycle Laundromat on Division Street, and there was this weird situation in the parking lot." My heart began racing before she even finished explaining. Emma had witnessed a woman matching my general description, young, average height, dark hair, in what appeared to be a heated confrontation with a man near the back of the laundromat around 9:45 p.m. that Tuesday. But when she looked more carefully, she realized the woman was blonde, not brunette, and was wearing completely different clothes than what Trevor had described me wearing.
The thing is, Emma continued, the guy looked really familiar, but I couldn't place him at first. Then when I saw his photo in that newspaper article, it was definitely the same person. But the woman with him wasn't the defendant. She was taller, blonde, and she was wearing this red jacket that was way too flashy for someone trying to sneak around. Jennifer and I exchanged glances across her office. A blonde woman in a red jacket arguing with Trevor in a laundromat parking lot at the exact time he claimed I was assaulting him at his apartment? This wasn't just an alibi witness. This was evidence of Trevor staging his entire story. Emma, Jennifer said carefully, did you see what happened after the argument? That's the weird part. After they talked for maybe 10 minutes, they both went into the laundromat together. Not like they were fighting anymore, but like they were working together on something. I was busy with customers, but I saw them at one of the back machines for maybe 20 minutes before they left together. The next morning, Jennifer and I drove to Spin Cycle Laundromat to meet Emma in person. She was a criminology major at Portland State, which explained both her attention to detail and her decision to come forward, despite her nervousness about getting involved in a legal case. The laundromat was a dingy, fluorescent-lit space that felt like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Emma led us to the back corner where she'd been working that night, pointing out the sightlines to the parking lot and the machine where she'd seen Trevor and the mysterious blonde woman. I kept wondering what they were doing back there, Emma said. It's not like you need two people to run a load of laundry. And they weren't acting like a couple, more like they were planning something. More importantly, Emma had something that could change everything. Spin Cycle Laundromat had security cameras, and unlike most businesses, they kept footage for 90 days because of frequent theft issues. The owner, Mr. Chen, another Chen, Portland was full of them, had installed a comprehensive system after losing thousands of dollars worth of equipment to break-ins. When Jennifer explained what we needed, Mr. Chen was initially reluctant to get involved, but Emma vouched for us, and when he learned that security footage might help prove someone's innocence, he agreed to review the recordings with us. The footage was better than I had dared to hope. The parking lot camera clearly showed Trevor arriving alone at 9:42 p.m. that Tuesday, followed 3 minutes later by a blonde woman in a distinctive red leather jacket driving a silver Honda Civic. The timestamp matched Emma's recollection perfectly. But it was the interior cameras that provided the breakthrough we desperately needed. At 9:58 p.m., the footage showed Trevor and the blonde woman at washing machine number 12 in the back corner of the laundromat. They weren't washing clothes. They were carefully examining something in a clear plastic bag, comparing it to an identical-looking item the woman had brought with her. They're switching bracelets, I whispered, watching the screen with growing amazement. She brought the fake bracelet, and they're making sure it looks enough like mine to be convincing. The woman held up both bracelets to the fluorescent light, pointing out details to Trevor. Then she carefully placed one bracelet, my real one, into her purse, while Trevor pocketed the fake one that would later be found at his apartment as evidence of my presence. But the most damning moment came at 10:14 p.m. when the camera caught Trevor examining his face in the reflection of the washing machine's glass door. He touched his cheek experimentally, then made a fist and struck himself in the face. Not hard enough to cause serious injury, but firmly enough to create the bruising that would later be documented at the urgent care clinic. The woman watched this self-inflicted violence with what appeared to be clinical detachment, occasionally offering suggestions that we couldn't hear but could see in her gestures. When Trevor seemed satisfied with the developing bruise, they both left together, with the woman following him in her Honda Civic towards the direction of his apartment. "This is it," Jennifer said, her voice filled with the kind of quiet triumph that comes after months of uphill battle. "This proves premeditation, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and perjury. Not only are you innocent, Willow, we can now prove that Trevor deliberately framed you with the help of an accomplice." The question now was identifying the blonde woman. Emma had never seen her before that night, and the security footage, while clear enough to show her actions, didn't provide a perfect view of her face. We needed to figure out who she was and why she was willing to participate in framing an innocent person for domestic violence.
The answer came through old-fashioned detective work. Jennifer hired a private investigator named David Kim, yes, another Kim, who specialized in digital forensics and background investigations. Using the Honda Civic's license plate number visible in the laundromat footage, he traced the car to a woman named Melissa Barnes, a 28-year-old paralegal who worked at a downtown law firm. More importantly, Melissa Barnes had a connection to our case that went beyond coincidence. She had been dating Trevor for the past month and a half. Social media posts showed them together at restaurants, concerts, and weekend trips, a relationship that had begun just 2 weeks after Trevor filed charges against me. She's not just his girlfriend, David explained during a meeting in Jennifer's office. She's his exit strategy. Think about it. Trevor files false charges against his ex-fiancé, gets sympathy as a domestic violence victim, and uses that narrative to explain why he needs emotional support from a new woman. Melissa gets cast as the caring woman who helped him heal from trauma. The timeline was sickeningly perfect. Trevor's first date with Melissa, according to her Instagram posts, was the day after he visited the urgent care clinic to document his self-inflicted injuries. He had literally turned his fabricated victimhood into a dating strategy. But Jennifer wanted more than just circumstantial evidence of their relationship. We needed proof that Melissa knew she was participating in a frame-up, not just helping a boyfriend she believed was genuinely traumatized. The breakthrough came when David discovered that Melissa Barnes wasn't just any paralegal. She worked at Henderson, Lynch & Associates, a law firm that had previously employed Amanda Hendricks before she joined the district attorney's office. Melissa and Amanda had overlapped for 8 months and maintained a professional relationship even after Amanda moved to the prosecutor's office. "This is not a coincidence," Jennifer said, spreading out a timeline on her conference table. Amanda recommends Melissa to Trevor. Melissa helps Trevor fabricate evidence against you. Amanda advises the prosecution on how to build the strongest case. It's a coordinated conspiracy involving someone currently employed by the DA's office. We now had not just evidence of Trevor's innocence-destroying plot, but proof of prosecutorial misconduct that could result in serious professional consequences for Amanda Hendricks. More importantly, for my case, we had video evidence that would not only exonerate me, but could lead to criminal charges against both Trevor and Melissa for filing false police reports, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. Jennifer filed an emergency motion to dismiss all charges, attaching copies of the laundromat security footage, the vehicle registration records, and David's investigation report documenting the connections between Trevor, Melissa, and Amanda. She also filed a formal complaint with the Oregon State Bar regarding Amanda's conduct and requested that the district attorney's office investigate potential prosecutorial misconduct. The response was swift and dramatic. Within 48 hours, Assistant District Attorney Rachel Voss called Jennifer's office, requesting an immediate meeting. When we arrived at the DA's office the next morning, we found Rachel looking haggard and defensive, accompanied by her supervisor, Chief Deputy District Attorney Michael Torres. "We've reviewed your evidence," Rachel began without preamble. "While we maintain that our prosecution was based on the information available at the time, we're prepared to discuss a resolution that acknowledges the new circumstances." Jennifer's response was ice-cold professional. "The new circumstances are that your office prosecuted an innocent woman based on fabricated evidence, while one of your former prosecutors was advising the conspiracy. This isn't about resolution, it's about justice and accountability." Michael Torres, a man in his 50s with the weathered look of someone who'd seen every kind of case imaginable, leaned forward with obvious discomfort. "Ms. Walsh, we're prepared to dismiss all charges against your client immediately. We're also launching an internal investigation into Amanda Hendricks' conduct. What more are you looking for?" Criminal charges against Trevor Hendricks and Melissa Barnes for conspiracy, filing false police reports, and evidence tampering. Jennifer replied without hesitation. The negotiation continued for 2 hours, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The laundromat footage was too clear, too damning, too impossible to explain away. By noon, we had an agreement. All charges against me would be dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never be refiled. The DA's office would issue a public statement acknowledging my innocence and the fabricated nature of the evidence. In exchange, Jennifer agreed not to pursue a civil lawsuit against the city for wrongful prosecution. As for Trevor and Melissa, their legal troubles were just beginning. Within a week, they would both be arrested on multiple felony charges related to their conspiracy.
Amanda Hendricks would resign from the DA's office under investigation by the Oregon State Bar, facing potential disbarment for her role in advising the fabrication of evidence. Walking out of the district attorney's office that afternoon, I felt like I was stepping into sunlight after months underground. The charges that had hung over my life like a sword for weeks were gone. My name was cleared. The truth had finally emerged, captured in pixels and timestamps that couldn't be manipulated or explained away. But more than vindication, I felt transformation. The woman who had been arrested 6 weeks earlier would have been satisfied just to have the charges dropped and her life returned to normal. The woman I had become through this ordeal wanted more than that. I wanted accountability. I wanted to ensure this could never happen to someone else. I wanted to use my experience to make the system better for the next person who found themselves falsely accused. The breakthrough had come not just in the form of security footage, but in the realization that I was stronger than I had ever imagined, that truth was worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossible, and that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that protect not just yourself, but everyone who might face similar injustice in the future.
The press conference announcing my vindication took place on the steps of the Multnomah County Courthouse on a crisp October morning, 6 weeks after my arrest. Jennifer stood at the podium flanked by Chief Deputy District Attorney Michael Torres and Detective Angela Morrison, all three united in an unlikely alliance that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. After a thorough investigation, we have determined that the charges against Ms. Willow Chen-Martinez were based on fabricated evidence, Torres announced to the gathered reporters. Ms. Chen-Martinez is completely innocent of all allegations, and we deeply regret that she was subjected to prosecution based on deliberate deception. I stood slightly behind the microphone cluster, wearing the same navy suit I'd worn to my preliminary hearing, but feeling like an entirely different person inside it. The scared, defensive woman who had first walked up these courthouse steps had been replaced by someone who understood her own strength, someone who had learned that justice wasn't a destination, but a practice that required active participation. When the reporters' questions came, they weren't just about the dismissal of charges. They wanted to know about Trevor's motives, about the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed my life, about what this case revealed about the vulnerability of the justice system to manipulation by those who understood how to exploit it. This case demonstrates that domestic violence charges, like all criminal accusations, must be evaluated based on evidence rather than assumptions, Jennifer explained to the gathered reporters. The fact that someone can fabricate such convincing evidence should concern all of us about the safeguards we have in place to protect innocent people. But it was Detective Morrison's comments that surprised me most. As law enforcement officers, we're trained to believe victims and take all allegations seriously, she said. However, this case has shown me the importance of thorough investigation even when initial evidence seems compelling. Ms. Chen-Martinez's persistence in maintaining her innocence, combined with the meticulous work of her defense team, ultimately revealed a sophisticated conspiracy that could have resulted in a wrongful conviction. The questions then turned to me. Standing at that podium, looking out at cameras and reporters who just weeks earlier would have been covering my criminal trial, I felt the full weight of transformation that had occurred within me. This experience has taught me that innocence isn't enough, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing to my system. You have to fight for truth even when, especially when, the system seems designed to work against you. But more importantly, I've learned that individual justice isn't enough either. We need to examine how easily the system can be manipulated and what we can do to protect the next person who finds themselves in my position. The aftermath of the press conference brought changes I hadn't anticipated. Within hours, my phone was ringing with calls from other attorneys, journalists, and advocacy groups. My story had resonated beyond just the specifics of my case. It had touched on broader themes about false accusations, prosecutorial accountability, and the ways in which abusers can weaponize the legal system against their victims. Patricia Richardson called me that afternoon to inform me that not only was my job secure, but that the firm wanted to discuss having me lead a new initiative on legal advocacy for falsely accused individuals. What you've been through has given you insights that none of us have. We think there's important work to be done helping people navigate these situations.
But the most meaningful call came from Emma Rodriguez, the laundromat witness whose courage had broken the case open. She was majoring in criminology with plans to become a defense attorney, and my case had reinforced her belief that the system needed advocates willing to dig deeper when something didn't feel right. I almost didn't call, she admitted. I kept thinking that surely the police and lawyers knew what they were doing, that my observations couldn't be that important. Your case taught me that sometimes regular people see things that professionals miss, and we have a responsibility to speak up. The criminal cases against Trevor and Melissa Barnes moved swiftly once the laundromat footage became evidence. Trevor was charged with filing false police reports, evidence tampering, assault in the 4th degree for hitting himself, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Melissa faced charges for conspiracy, evidence tampering, and accessory to filing false reports. Their trials became a media sensation, partly because of the unusual nature of the conspiracy, but mostly because it highlighted how domestic violence charges could be weaponized by actual abusers against their victims. Legal experts appeared on news programs discussing the case's implications for how allegations should be investigated and how evidence should be authenticated. Amanda Hendricks resigned from the district attorney's office before the state bar investigation concluded, but her damage to her career was irreversible. The legal community is small, and her role in advising a conspiracy to frame an innocent person ended any possibility of her practicing law in Oregon. She moved to Arizona, where she now works in compliance for a small insurance company, a dramatic fall from her previous position as a rising star in prosecution.
3 months after my vindication, I found myself testifying before a state legislative committee examining reforms to domestic violence prosecution procedures. The experience of sitting at a witness table in the Oregon State Capitol, explaining to lawmakers how the system had failed me and what could be done to prevent similar failures, felt surreal. The challenge, I explained to the committee, is balancing the need to take all allegations seriously with the requirement for thorough investigation. In my case, the initial investigators accepted the evidence at face value without adequately examining its authenticity or consistency. Basic forensic examination of the planted bracelet would have revealed that it wasn't mine. More thorough investigation of the timeline would have identified the gaps in the prosecution's theory. One of the committee members, Representative Sarah Kim, asked about the psychological impact of false accusations. What would you want other people in your situation to know about surviving this kind of ordeal? It was a question I'd been thinking about constantly since my vindication. I'd want them to know that it changes you, but it doesn't have to destroy you, I said. I'm not the same person I was before this happened, but I'm not sure I'd want to be. This experience taught me things about my own strength, about the importance of community support, about how justice actually works, not how we wish it worked, but how it really functions. Those lessons have value, even though I wouldn't wish the process on anyone. The legislative committee ultimately recommended several reforms: mandatory forensic examination of physical evidence in domestic violence cases, requirements for corroborating evidence when allegations arise long after alleged incidents, and enhanced penalties for filing false reports that waste investigative resources and harm legitimate victims. But my personal transformation extended beyond advocacy work. The architectural projects I designed began incorporating themes of resilience and community protection. A women's shelter I helped design featured secure spaces that prioritized both safety and dignity. A community center project included meeting rooms specifically configured for support groups and legal consultations. My relationship with Marcus deepened during the ordeal, evolving from workplace friendship to something more meaningful. He had seen me at my most vulnerable and stood by me without hesitation. When we finally went on our first official date 6 months after my vindication, it felt like a celebration not just of romantic possibility, but of survival and growth. "You know what I find most attractive about you?" he said over dinner at a quiet restaurant in the Alberta district. "It's not that you survived this, though that's remarkable. It's that you decided to use what you learned to help other people. You could have just put your head down and returned to normal life, but instead you chose to make the experience meaningful."
The civil lawsuit against Trevor and Melissa was settled out of court for an amount that covered my legal fees and provided financial security while I transitioned into advocacy work. More importantly, the settlement required them to participate in a restorative justice program where they would have to face the full impact of their actions on my life and the lives of their families. The restorative justice session took place in a conference room at the Community Mediation Center, facilitated by a trained mediator and attended by Jennifer, myself, Trevor, Melissa, and their respective attorneys. It was the first time I'd been in the same room with Trevor since our breakup, and seeing him across that conference table, thin, hollow-eyed, and clearly broken by the consequences of his choices, provoked unexpected feelings of pity rather than anger. "I want you to understand what you put me through," I said, looking directly at both of them. "You didn't just try to send me to jail. You tried to destroy my reputation, my career, my sense of safety in the world. You weaponized a system designed to protect victims of domestic violence, and in doing so, you made it harder for real victims to be believed." Trevor's apology, when it came, seemed genuine in its brokenness. He admitted that he was angry about losing control. "When you left me, I felt like I had lost something that belonged to me. I know now how sick that thinking was, but at the time I convinced myself that you deserved to suffer the way I was suffering." Melissa's participation had been motivated by different factors: infatuation with Trevor, excitement about being part of what he presented as a justified response to my alleged harassment, and professional curiosity about how evidence could be constructed and presented. Her apology focused on the intellectual arrogance that had let her participate in destroying someone's life, as if it were an interesting legal exercise. The session didn't provide closure in the Hollywood sense. There were no tears of reconciliation or moments of dramatic forgiveness, but it did provide something more valuable: a full accounting of what had been done to me and why, which allowed me to understand the experience as something that had happened because of their choices, rather than because of anything inherent in me or my character. Walking out of that mediation session, I realized that the transformation wasn't complete. It might never be complete, but I had evolved from someone who had justice done to her into someone who actively participated in creating justice for others. The scared woman who had received Detective Morrison's first phone call no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood that survival isn't just about enduring what happens to you, it's about deciding who you become because of what happens to you. The woman I had become was stronger, more aware, more committed to truth and justice than the person I'd been before this experience. And while I wouldn't have chosen this path, I couldn't deny that I was proud of who I'd become by walking it.
1 year later, I stood in the conference room of the newly established Chen-Martinez Legal Defense Foundation, looking out at a view of Portland's skyline that had once seemed impossibly distant during those dark weeks when my future hung in legal limbo. The foundation occupied the top floor of a renovated building in the Pearl District, just 6 blocks from where I used to work at Richardson and Associates. Close enough to my old life to remember where I came from, far enough to represent how completely everything had changed. The morning's intake meeting was about to begin. 3 new clients sat around the polished conference table. Maria Santos, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and nervous hands, leaned forward. "My principal says that even if the charges are dropped, the allegation will always be in my personnel file, that parents will always wonder, how do you rebuild from that?" It was the question I'd been asked dozens of times over the past year, and my answer had evolved through experience. "You don't rebuild the same life you had before," I said gently. "You build a different one, hopefully a better one. The person you were before this happened to you was vulnerable to this kind of attack precisely because she trusted systems to work fairly. The person you become after surviving it understands how to protect herself and others." The foundation had grown beyond anything I had initially imagined. What had started as a small nonprofit focused on legal defense had expanded into a comprehensive support system for people facing false accusations. We provided legal representation through a network of attorneys trained in our specialized protocols, financial assistance for those who couldn't afford adequate defense, and most importantly, a community of survivors who understood the unique trauma of being falsely accused. Our protocols were based on lessons learned from my own case and the dozens we'd handled since. Immediate evidence preservation was crucial. We had developed partnerships with digital forensics experts who could rapidly secure security footage, communication records, and other time-sensitive evidence before it could be deleted or corrupted. We maintained a database of expert witnesses who could testify about everything from digital evidence authentication to the psychology of false accusations. But perhaps most importantly, we had created a support network that addressed the psychological impact of false accusations, something the traditional legal system was poorly equipped to handle. Being falsely accused creates a unique form of trauma that combines the stress of potential criminal penalties with the existential horror of having your reality questioned by people in authority. Traditional victim support services weren't designed for people in our situation, so we had built our own. The Foundation's success had brought national attention. I regularly testified before legislative committees in other states, consulted on policy reforms with prosecutors' offices that were genuinely committed to preventing wrongful prosecutions, and spoke at conferences about the intersection of domestic violence advocacy and false accusation prevention. The work had also brought me full circle with some of the people from my original case. Detective Angela Morrison had become an informal advisor to the Foundation, helping us train other law enforcement officers to recognize the signs of fabricated evidence and coached accusations. Her experience with my case had made her a more thorough investigator and a more effective advocate for genuine victims. The hardest part, she explained during a training session we conducted for Portland Police Bureau detectives, is maintaining skepticism about evidence while still taking allegations seriously. Willow's Chase taught me that being thorough isn't the same as being suspicious, and that the best way to protect real victims is to ensure that fake ones don't undermine the system's credibility. Even Emma Rodriguez, the laundromat witness whose courage had broken my case open, had become part of the Foundation's extended family. Now, in her senior year studying criminal justice, she worked part-time as a case researcher, helping us investigate the background details that often proved crucial in false accusation cases. I learned from your case that regular people have a responsibility to speak up when they see something that doesn't fit. The system depends on citizens being engaged and alert, not just letting professionals handle everything. My personal life had evolved alongside my professional transformation. Marcus and I had married the previous spring in a small ceremony at Powell Boot, surrounded by the community of friends and family who had supported us through the darkest period of both our lives. Our wedding vows included promises not just about traditional marriage commitments, but about continuing to fight for justice and truth together.
We had purchased a small house in the Irvington neighborhood, a 1920s craftsman that we were slowly renovating together. The house included a dedicated home office where I could work on Foundation cases, and an art studio where Marcus pursued his passion for architectural photography. Most importantly, it had a large fenced yard where Scout, now graying around his muzzle but still energetic, could play with Luna, the rescue dog we'd adopted 6 months after our wedding. My relationship with my parents had deepened through the ordeal and its aftermath. They visited Portland monthly, and my father had become one of the Foundation's most effective fundraisers, drawing on his network of educator colleagues to support our work. My mother had joined the board of directors, bringing her skills as a former high school counselor to help us develop better support protocols for clients' families. The most unexpected relationship that had emerged was with Jennifer Walsh, my former defense attorney who had become both a close friend and the Foundation's legal director. Jennifer had taken a significant pay cut to leave private practice and join our organization, motivated by her belief that my case represented a broader problem that needed systematic attention. "Your case broke something open for me," she explained during a quiet moment at the Foundation's first anniversary celebration. "I realized I had been treating false accusations as isolated incidents, individual injustices to be corrected one at a time. But they're actually symptoms of systemic problems that require systematic solutions."
The foundation's impact was measurable. In our first year, we had provided legal representation to 47 people facing false accusations, achieving dismissals or acquittals in 89% of cases. More importantly, we had documented patterns in how false accusations were constructed and presented, information that we shared with law enforcement agencies and prosecutors' offices to help them identify fabricated evidence more quickly. We had also begun tracking the broader social impact of our work. Traditional domestic violence advocacy organizations had initially viewed us with suspicion, worried that our focus on false accusations might undermine support for genuine victims. But over time, many had come to understand that protecting innocent people from false charges actually strengthened the credibility of the system that protected real victims. Sarah Martinez, the director of Portland Women's Crisis Center, had become an unexpected ally. What Willow's organization does isn't in competition with what we do, she explained during a joint conference on domestic violence policy. We're all working to ensure that people who need protection get it, and that the system maintains the credibility necessary to provide that protection. False accusations hurt everyone. They hurt innocent defendants, they hurt real victims who might not be believed, and they hurt the community's faith in justice. The policy changes we had advocated for were beginning to take effect across the country. Oregon had implemented enhanced evidence authentication requirements for domestic violence cases. California had created specialized training for prosecutors handling delayed reporting situations. Texas had established funding for indigent defense in false accusation cases. Each reform was small in isolation, but together they represented a growing recognition that the justice system needed better safeguards against manipulation. But the most meaningful measure of our success wasn't statistical, it was personal. Every month we received letters from people whose cases we had handled, updating us on their lives and careers, thanking us for helping them reclaim their futures. Maria Santos had been cleared of all charges and promoted to assistant principal. David Chen had successfully launched a new business and was considering running for city council. Jennifer Park had completed law school and was now working as a prosecutor, bringing her unique perspective to her work evaluating domestic violence cases. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I walked through the Foundation's small museum, a collection of case files, legal documents, and photographs that told the story of each person we had helped. At the center of the display was a simple frame containing the security camera image from Spin Cycle Laundromat, showing Trevor hitting himself in the face, along with a small plaque that read, "Truth doesn't always emerge automatically. Sometimes it requires someone brave enough to look for it." The drive home took me past many of the locations that had been significant during my own legal ordeal. The police station where I had first been questioned, the courthouse where I had been vindicated, the coffee shop where Marcus and I had planned our defense strategy over countless cups of coffee and shared determination. But I no longer saw these places as sites of trauma. They had become landmarks in a journey that had transformed not just me, but everyone who had been part of the story. The scared woman who had received Detective Morrison's phone call 2 years earlier had evolved into someone who understood that justice isn't something that happens to you. It's something you actively create through your choices, your courage, and your commitment to truth. When I pulled into our driveway that evening, Scout was waiting at the front window, tail wagging with the same enthusiasm he'd shown every evening for the past 3 years. Marcus was in the kitchen preparing dinner and probably listening to one of his architecture podcasts. The house smelled like garlic and herbs, and the late afternoon light was filtering through the windows we'd installed the previous summer. It was a quiet, ordinary evening in a life that had been rebuilt from the ground up. But it was also a life that carried within it the knowledge that ordinary moments are precious, precisely because they can be threatened, and that protecting them for yourself and for others requires vigilance, courage, and the understanding that truth is not a destination, but a practice that must be renewed every day. The woman that I had become understood that being falsely accused was the worst thing that ever happened to me. But she also understood that who I became because of it was the best thing I had ever accomplished. And tomorrow, I would get up and do the work again, helping other innocent people reclaim their lives and their faith in the possibility of justice, one case at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.